The new Justice Secretary's plans to address the issue of prison capacity crisis and to free prisoners early is actually not so dissimilar from the previous government that freed a number of prisoners 70 days early anyway. I think they freed 10,000 prisoners because the prisons are literally full. And we are imprisoning people for quite ridiculous reasons. For example, we kept Julian Assange in solitary confinement for years for no other reason than that he fled his bail conditions to the Ecuadorian embassy. Why? Because he didn't believe that he was going to get proper justice in Britain. He didn't. He was right. He was right. And finally, when he was released, he walked freely to the plane, and yet there was all this talk about Britain not being able to do anything because of extradition treaties, because of international obligations, and yet he walked freely to the plane. The extradition treaties, I believe, were still in effect. So we have to seriously ask if our justice is doing its proper job. And there are many ways of treating people who have fallen into a criminal life. There are many ways of treating them other than putting them in prison. And Shabana Mahmood talks about a total breakdown in law and order, and the proposed changes aim to reduce the time served for some custodial sentences from 50% to 40%. That seems a good proposal, with exclusions for serious violent offenders and those convicted of sex or domestic abuse crimes. The plans, I think one shouldn't be looking at the crime. I think one should be looking at the criminal. But actually, the probation service and the justice service is supposed to do precisely that. We have an increasingly vocal social media which thinks that the people who are being punished should be punished for a specific crime. Actually, the punishment for one person may be excessive for another person. Punishment is there to correct, primarily. And the prisons are a corrective institution. If they're not doing that job, then they're not doing, then the only purpose that they serve is to keep one part of the population away from the other part of the population. And that's a very primitive understanding of prisons. We have had years of prison reform, talk of prison reform, going back into the 19th century. Elizabeth Fry was on our banknotes. And we should have learnt something. And to have a person as Prime Minister who has an understanding of this system, I think, is a great advantage. So what takes place under his watch, I think, has the wisdom of experience. The plans which need parliamentary approval are intended to be temporary measures, emergency measures only, and they will come into force in September, applying to those already past the 40% mark of their sentence. Mahmood emphasised the urgency of the situation, citing risks of increased violence, police cells being used as prison overflow and court delays. We need to sort out all of this. But fundamentally, we need to ask, does the punishment fit the crime, or does the punishment fit the person? And the person is the key. And we need to discourage crime rather than punish it. If we can discourage crime, then we don't need to punish it. And of course, crime statistics are always misleading because they're recording what we can measure, what we can see. Doesn't mean that crime is necessarily increasing. It simply means that we're better at monitoring it, I hope. But ideally, we need to decrease that crime. We need to prevent the crime. We need to put in place measures which make the crime unlikely. And Keir Starmer had previously criticised the Conservative government's handling of the prison system, calling it unforgivable, and he stressed the importance of having adequate prison capacity. The National Police Chiefs Council supports the government's swift action and emphasises the need to support victims and families affected by these changes. And indeed, you only have to listen to Rory Stewart to realise how badly damaged our prison system has been for so many years. And Mahmoud has said, let me be clear, she said, this is an emergency measure. This is not a permanent change. I am unapologetic in my belief that criminals should be punished. They should. But we must punish the person, not the crime. And we must go out of our way to discourage crime, rather than to be focusing entirely on prisons and on prison overflow. So the temporary measures, I think, very valuable indeed. And Mahmoud was speaking in Northamptonshire, not far from where I am, at HM Prisons 5 Wells in Northamptonshire, and talked about the problem with officers unable to act. Criminals could do whatever they want without consequence. We could see looters running amok, smashing in windows, robbing shops, setting neighbourhoods alight. And this is because the police are being forced into a position where they are becoming de facto prison officers, and that is taking up their time. We need to release the police. We need to free up prison spaces. And we need to find a way to discourage crime. And that probably, the old tradition is that is effected by having police visible on the beat. I think there are other ways that one can discourage crime. And we need to look at a vast range of ways to change our society for the better. Because deterrence is not the best medicine. Deterrence is simply fear. We need to transform our society rather than frighten our society.